Hello and welcome back. Episode number 3 in the Principles of Exercise, Fitness and Health. And today's subject is monitoring exercise intensity. And before we go and look at the LOs for today, I want to have a little bit of a talk about monitoring exercise intensity and why it's an important tool for you to have as a gym instructor and ultimately a personal trainer. And think about this, okay? If you're working with a client in the gym or outdoors, wherever it might be, you need to know what intensity they're working at, number 1, so that they're safe, and number 2, so that you know that you're going to get results for them. Because if they're not working hard enough, they're not going to get any results and they're not going to keep using your services, okay? And as PTs, yes, we want to make people healthy and we want them to be nutritious and live really, really, really happy lives, but we also need to look after ourselves a little bit, and people need to be paying us. So we need to make sure they're getting results, and the way to do this is by monitoring the intensity that they work of. And therefore, the aim of today's session is to gain an understanding of how to safely monitor exercise intensity. And in particular, we'll be able to look at 3 different ways of monitoring exercise intensity. We have rate of perceived exertion, otherwise known as RPE. We have heart rate monitor training and the use of heart rate zones. And we have something called the talk test. So, as we've touched on at the start of the presentation, people need to be safe when they work out, and if we're pushing them too hard, they're not going to be safe. If someone falls over and collapses or faints during your session and people see it on the gym floor or in the park where you're training someone, it's not going to be brilliant for your reputation, okay? So yes, we want to push people hard, but we need to keep them safe at the same time, and different trainers will use different methods, and I'll talk through the pros and cons of each method as we go through the presentation. And some trainers will use a combination of methods as well. So depending on who you're working with, what the client goals are, what they prefer, you might choose a different effort depending on that. So let's have a look at heart rate first of all, okay? So we can use heart rate to measure how hard someone's working, because I think as we all probably know by now, the harder and more quickly the heart's beating, therefore the harder the person is working and the more demands and the more stress is being put on the body. And the main methods that are used to measure someone's heart rate, we can take their pulse. So put our 2 fingers on the wrist or the neck, we can measure their pulse, we can do it manually. What's more accurate is to use a heart rate monitor, and a lot of the machines that we use in the gym today, particularly CV machines, will have a built-in heart rate monitor that you can get your client to put their hands on, and it'll kick out a rating that their heart rate is. However, we need to be a little bit careful when we're using the sensors on the machines. We need to check they're accurate, first of all, and also if we're on the treadmill, a lot of treadmills nowadays will come with a sensor built in for someone to hold on to. Now, for someone to use safe running technique, do we want them to be holding on to the bars at the front of the treadmill, or do we want them to be able to swing their arms in a nice, normal, natural motion? You know, we want them to be safe, so we need to be going with number 2. And I wouldn't particularly encourage anyone to have their client holding on to the bars at the front of the treadmill if they want them to be safe. And just going back to heart rate for a second, it's measured in something called beats per minute. So that's essentially, or BPM as it may be abbreviated to. And beats per minute is the amount of times our heart is beating every single minute. And there's a very simple way to work out someone's maximal heart rate. So if you want to know the absolute max that your heart can do, take the number 220, all right? Take away your age from that number, and that will give you a very rough idea of someone's maximal heart rate. So if someone is aged 20, for example, we do 220, take away 20, which is their age, and therefore their maximum heart rate will be around about 200. That's a very rough way of doing things, but it gives us a good guide to go by. And just going back again to measuring heart rate, I think my personal favourite, and I think the best way to do it, is to get your client to wear a heart rate monitor. So normally has a little strap that goes around the chest, and then it will have a watch that goes on the wrist as normal, and that will give you a reading for heart rate. Okay, can be a little bit expensive, but you do get what you pay for. And if you want to accurately measure someone's heart rate, I would really sort of recommend investing in a good heart rate monitor. We then have heart rate zones. So there's different zones of heart rate. So if our heart is beating at a certain percentage of our max, we can then make an assumption as to how hard that person is training. So if we read through the text, it says, once an individual's maximum heart rate has been determined, the trainer can decide on what proportion of this represents an effective aerobic intensity. And research indicates that an exercise intensity equivalent of 60 to 90% of max is appropriate for most clients. So if my client has a 200 max, we want to be aiming for 60 to 90% of that maximal heart rate to give them an effective workout. And when we say aim for 60 to 90%, that's what we want to keep them in for the majority of the workout. We don't just want to get to 90 right at the end and then be like, right, finished, done. Okay, we want to be in between 60 to 90 for the majority of our workout. And there's a major myth associated with aerobic training zones, and you've probably seen it on machines in the gym, and it'll say work at this percentage to burn fat, work at this percentage to build cardio, alright? But truth is, and research says, that if we're working in that 60 to 90% zone, then we're going to be increasing metabolism and burning fat, and there's no perfect zone to be in. It'll be dependent or different on person to person, depending on their genetics and how often they work out. So that's heart rate, and that's how we can measure heart rate. And when some of you get to the planning stage in sort of in unit 5 of the gym instructor, you might want to put in some heart rate zones, or some you could even put some percentages. So 60% of max, 70% of max, 80% of max, and the higher we go, the harder the person's going to be working. And you need to be sensible as well. Don't put somebody on 90% of their maximal heart rate for a 45-minute workout, because it's not going to be sustainable for them. Okay, if you want to go and do a 45-minute steady run, sure thing, put them on 60%, 70%. Don't put them on 90, it's going to be too high. All right. We then have another method of measuring intensity. It's called rate of perceived exertion, or RPE. And this is a very simple way of doing it, but it's also very effective. And the way this tends to work is we ask the client how they're feeling as they work out. Okay, so there's a classic scale, and the scale gives ratings between 6 and 20. All right, so 20 is working absolutely as hard as you can. 6 is really, I've only just started, I'm just about going. So the way this would work, if you imagine a scenario where my client is working on the treadmill, and I'm standing next to the treadmill, I'm checking their form, I'm making sure they're running safely and using the correct technique. And while I'm doing that, I might say, how are you feeling now? Out of 6 to 20, how are you feeling right now? Oh, I'm at a 6, really. I've just started. Oh, right, okay. Well, if you're at 6, we need to bring you up a little bit, because we want you working a little bit harder than that so you can get results. And the chart on this slide here gives us a real good representation of beats per minute equated to RPE. So if someone says to you, I feel at about an 11, they're at about 100 to 110 beats per minute, and we want to get them up a bit higher than that. We normally want our people to be working somewhere between 12 and 16 for the majority of our workouts. So if they're giving us those lower numbers, when we say, okay, how are you feeling? We need to get them working a little bit harder. And the way to do that is we either up the speed that they're currently working at, or we go for a longer duration of time. Okay? We then have something called the torque test, and the torque test again is not as accurate as the previous two. So heart rate is the most accurate. We then have the middle area, which is RPE, which is a bit less accurate than heart rate, but it's more accurate than the torque test. And the way the torque test works is essentially, as the trainer, we talk to or hold a conversation with the client. And if the client is breathing lightly and talking easily, they're therefore doing light activity and the heart rate isn't very high. If they can talk comfortably but breathing is deeper and a bit more quickly, that would be classed as moderate activity. And we then have vigorous activity. So breathing is quite deep and it gets a little bit difficult to talk. And benefit of doing this is that as we talk to the client, as we should be, we're building rapport with the client, we're making sure they're happy. And as we do this, we should be clued in, all right, they're struggling to talk now, this could be getting a bit tough. Do we need to make it a little bit more easy? Or, all right, well, we've been going for 10 minutes and still really having this conversation quite easily. Do we need to up the intensity and get them working a little bit harder? And personally, I like to use the torque test with a combination of the heart rate monitor, always sort of talking to the client and making sure they're happy and building that rapport and telling them why we're doing what we're doing. And as we do that, we can also use the heart rate monitor with it. But when you do your practical activity, guys, I would be looking for you to use one of these methods to make sure that your client is exercising safely. And as you start to get more experienced, you'll find which method works for you. And I think if you do get really serious into the PT and you're very, very serious about client results and you're working with, in particular, elite athletes or people who are looking for increased sports performance, you will end up going down the heart rate monitor use. When you first start, you might find it easier, especially if you're working with clients who maybe want to lose weight or are not experienced in the gym. You might find it easier to use RPE. And I think everyone and every clued up personal trainer really should be using that torque test because it is a real simple one to do. I hope it's made sense today. I know it's been a quick one, but choose which one of those areas is the easiest for you to deliver and which one is going to get you the best results. Have a practice with it as you practice your practical and make sure you're aware of it as well for your principles assessment. Nice, short, sharp and sweet, and I'll see you again at the next presentation.